It was to be a peaceful weekend. I had taken the long route up to my lake cabin, enjoying the winding forest roads and the soft murmur of pine trees swaying in the wind. My guest, Elena, longtime friend and former federal prosecutor, had flown in from DC for a break from the grind. I hadn't told anyone she was staying with me, especially not the HOA, because it frankly wasn't their business. The property was mine, deeded directly to me and outside the HOA's jurisdiction, something I had proved more times than I cared to count. But Karen, the HOA president, had always insisted my cabin was subject to community standards, despite repeated legal clarifications proving otherwise. I suspected she simply hated the fact that I wouldn't bend to her control. That Friday evening, Elena and I sat on the porch sipping coffee, talking about everything from politics to the wild turkeys roaming the woods. It was late when we turned in, but the peace wouldn't last. Around 6 the next morning, I was jolted awake by banging fists pounding against the cabin door like a battering ram. My first thought was that there had been an emergency. I rushed to the front, half-dressed, and opened the window to look out. What I saw made my blood boil. Karen was standing with 2 private security contractors hired thugs with HOA enforcement patches, and they were holding bolt cutters and what looked like a crowbar. "Elena," I said, stepping away from the window. "Stay inside. Call the sheriff. Now." "What's going on?" she asked, already pulling out her phone. "They're trying to force their way in." The banging intensified. "Open the door, now!" Karen shouted. "This is your final warning. You are under arrest for non-compliance with HOA rules and repeated defiance of official directives." "Arrest?" I muttered. "She's lost it." I opened the door just a crack and stared out. "Karen, this is not HOA property. You don't have any authority here. Leave." She smirked. "You think you can hide behind legal paperwork? Your guest didn't check in. That's a violation of community safety regulations. She doesn't need to check in with anyone. This is private land. You're trespassing." Karen stepped forward and nodded to the hired men. "Do it." Before I could react, the crowbar smashed into the doorframe, splintering the wood. Elena was behind me now, filming everything with her phone. "Don't interfere," Karen barked at her. "You're part of this?" Elena didn't flinch. "This is being recorded. You're about to commit unlawful entry and assault." But Karen was...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Commit unlawful entry and assault. But Karen wasn't listening. With a loud crack, the men forced the door open and pushed inside. I stepped in front of Elena, shielding her. But she wasn't intimidated. She calmly walked around me, standing straight in front of Karen, with an authority I hadn't seen since the last time she was in court. "Karen Delancey," she said coolly, "you just violated multiple state statutes, including criminal trespass, unlawful entry, and impersonation of law enforcement. My name is Elena Graves. I'm a former federal prosecutor. You're going to want to leave before this gets worse for you." Karen hesitated. Her mouth twitched like she wasn't sure whether to back down or escalate. The 2 enforcers looked confused. I have jurisdiction," she stammered. "The HOA has standing authority not here," Elena cut in, stepping closer. "This cabin sits outside your HOA's boundaries. I've reviewed the parcel maps, zoning documents, and the original property deed. You're trespassing, and now you're being filmed doing it. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" I added, "You just broke my front door. You're going to pay for that. Legally." Karen's face turned pale. The men with her lowered their tools and began slowly backing toward the porch. "Don't move," Elena snapped. "You're complicit in a break-in. I've already called the county sheriff. You might want to stick around and explain yourselves." Karen looked between us, then bolted. She ran down the gravel path toward her car, leaving the men standing awkwardly in the destroyed entryway. One of them muttered, "We were told this was sanctioned." "It wasn't," Elena said flatly. "You're lucky we're not restraining you right now." 10 minutes later, the sheriff arrived. I knew him well. Deputy Colton had helped me resolve 2 previous disputes with the HOA. When he saw the shattered door, the hired security men, and Karen's car fleeing the scene, his jaw tightened. "Let me guess," he said, looking at the mess. "Karen again. Broke in. Claimed she had authority," I said. Elena stepped forward, handing over her phone. I recorded the whole thing. She tried to arrest him, then fled. Deputy Colton shook his head. "That woman is going to end up in cuffs sooner or later." "She's overdue," I muttered. We filed formal statements. Elena gave him a copy of the recording. The security men were detained temporarily while their involvement was investigated. Karen was nowhere to be found, but she wouldn't get far. Colton assured us a warrant would be filed for questioning, and if charges were approved, she'd face court. That was fine by me. I had no doubt Elena would make sure it stuck. Later that evening, after the door was repaired and things quieted down, Elena and I sat by the fire pit. "She really thought she could arrest you," she said, shaking her head. "She thinks she owns the entire lake," I replied. But today, that fantasy ended. Elena smirked, sipping her drink. I hope she enjoyed the illusion, because tomorrow, we take this public. As the echoes of that splintering wood faded into the thick, pine-scented air of the forest, the absurdity of the situation didn't hit me right away. Instead, my reflexes honed through years of military training kicked in first. My hand instinctively reached toward the side drawer under the hall table where I kept a flashlight and an old Marine-issued survival knife, not because I expected a fight, but because I never faced.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Survival knife, not because I expected a fight, but because I never faced uncertainty. Unarmed. The sound that followed the crash was unmistakable. A triumphant, theatrical voice screeching, "This is a citizen's arrest. You are in violation of HOA mandates." That was the moment it hit me. Karen. Not just any Karen, but the same HOA enforcer who'd been circling my property like a vulture for the last 6 months. Every week, she found some obscure new code or invented infraction non-standard mailbox flag, unsanctioned plant height, excessively reflective window tint to harass me with. But this time, she had taken things to a whole new level. She wasn't just writing fines or yelling from across the property line. She had broken down my cabin door. I stepped into the living room slowly, flashlight in hand. But what I saw made me pause. Karen stood in the wreckage of my entryway, clipboard in hand, her phone raised like it was a badge of authority. Behind her were 2 local code compliance officers, both looking increasingly unsure of themselves, and one large, out-of-breath man wearing an ill-fitting security vest that simply read, HOA Volunteer Tammy. Patrol. My guest, who had just arrived that morning, stood frozen near the fireplace, wide-eyed but calm. What Karen didn't, no, what none of them knew, was that my guest wasn't just a quiet friend visiting for a weekend of fishing. She was a federal judge. And she was filming the entire thing on her phone, cool as a glacier. "Ma'am," I said, voice level, "you've just committed a Class B felony by forcibly entering a private residence. You're going to want to leave. Now." Karen laughed, her voice a grating mix of disbelief and arrogance. "This is community property. You're not authorized to have unauthorized guests during non-holiday weekends without HOA notification." I raised an eyebrow. "Community property? Karen, this cabin is 2 miles outside the HOA perimeter. I have the deed, and I've told you this before. You're trespassing." The code officers exchanged glances. Clearly, they hadn't been briefed on that detail. One of them finally spoke up. "Karen, did you confirm the jurisdiction before doing this?" Karen scoffed, stepping forward. Don't be ridiculous. We can't have road homeowners inviting anyone they want. What are these harboring fugitives? The judge coughed lightly from her corner. Technically, she said, stepping into the light, I'm a sitting judge for the U.S. District Court, and I've just witnessed an unlawful entry and attempted false arrest under colour of authority. Karen blinked. Her face paled. But I wasn't finished. Karen blinked, her self-righteous demeanour cracking like the door she'd just kicked in. And for a moment, even the clipboard, her sacred weapon of HOA enforcement, trembled in her grip as the weight of what she'd done began to dawn on her. But it was far too late for hesitation, because Judge Elena, Monsieur, standing all 5'8" in a slate-grey hiking jacket with the seal of the United States Courts still visible beneath her vest, was already speaking with a calm steeliness that made everyone in the room stop calm. Breathing? You just committed a very serious crime under colour of law, ma'am, and not only are you trespassing, you have now obstructed a federal officer, which is a separate felony, she said, stepping forward with her phone still rolling and the red dot blinking like a silent siren, and I could see the confusion flash across the faces of the two compliance officers who clearly hadn't signed up for this level of cambrie. Legal disaster, especially not with someone who could summon federal marshals with a single call, and the so-called HOA volunteer patrolman, whose name tag read Dale in cheap plastic, began to inch backward like someone trying to blend into the wood panelling, but I took a single step forward and said, no one's leaving until we document everything, because I had waited 6 long months for Karen to overstep this far, and I wasn't about to let her slip away now that she had literally destroyed my front door to enforce fake rules she invented herself. And as she opened her mouth to protest again, the judge interrupted her with a single sentence that shut the entire room down. If you say one more word, I'll have the DOJ investigate your entire HOA board. And silence settled over the room like fog, heavy and inescapable, as the legal implications began to swirl in Karen's head like a tornado of consequences. And in the silence that followed, I took the opportunity to activate the secondary security camera feed from my phone app, which showed the exact moment Karen and her flunkies marched up the path with bolt cutters and a handheld battering ram they must have borrowed from a theatrical prop department, and I heard Elena whisper, "That's forced entry. Destruction of private property, attempted false detainment, and possibly impersonation of a peace officer depending on how this HOA operates." And even the code officers looked horrified now. One of them, murmuring, "We didn't agree to this," while the other quietly radioed their supervisor, probably hoping to escape the career-ending fallout they now saw coming. But it was too late, because the footage, the audio recordings, and the testimonies we were gathering were already backed up to the cloud, time-stamped, and about to be handed over to the county sheriff and the state attorney general's office, who were no strangers to HOA abuse cases, but rarely had evidence this crystal clear. And I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction as Elena turned toward me and said, "You're going to want to call your lawyer just to get this
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
You're going to want to call your lawyer just to get this rolling, because this is going to end up in federal court before long." And I nodded slowly. Not because I needed the advice. I'd already documented everything from the moment Karen began her campaign of harassment months ago, but because it was time to escalate and finally dismantle the HOA's illegal overreach for good. And when the sheriff's deputy finally arrived, having gotten my earlier alert and seen the triggered alarm on the property entry sensor, he took one look at the door, the footage, the trembling woman with a broken clipboard, and the judge calmly explaining the federal statutes violated, and said with a shake of his head, "Well, Karen, you really messed up this time," before asking her to step outside while he made some calls. And as she sputtered in disbelief that she might be arrested for just doing her duty, the judge calmly responded, "Your duty ends where the Constitution begins." And I knew in that moment we weren't just witnessing karma, we were watching justice unfold in real time. The fallout began almost immediately, not with fireworks, but with a deafening silence that blanketed the entire Lakefront community, as word of what had happened the previous night began to spread like wildfire through texts, whispered porch conversations, angry HOA group chats, most of which I had long since been removed from after declining their voluntary compliance agreement. My cabin, once a peaceful and humble retreat, nestled between old-growth pines and a slope of wildflowers sloping down to the water, had now become a focal point of legal scrutiny and moral debate, the kind of spectacle that made even the most neutral neighbors pick a side. But the one thing no one could argue with, no matter how loudly HOA President Lynn Carrow tried to spin it, was that she and her enforcer squad had forcibly broken down my front door, tried to perform a civilian's version of a citizen's arrest, and found themselves staring down the calm, cool, and heavily credentialed face of my weekend guest, Major Alana, Reed-retired Army JAG officer, and now a federal investigator for the Inspector General's office. She hadn't even raised her voice. That's the part that kept replaying in my mind the steady tone she'd used when identifying herself. The way she held her badge without dramatics, her presence like a dam halting a flood of HOA idiocy that had, for too long, been washing unchecked through this neighborhood. After they left, humiliated and shaken, she helped me board up the door and make a detailed list of everything that had been damaged, taken, or violated. And then she made a few calls. Not to 911. Not to local law enforcement, though we documented everything for them as well, but to internal contacts at the state and federal level. Her calm demeanor belied the seriousness of what was now set in motion. "This isn't just trespassing," she told me over coffee the next morning. This was unlawful entry, impersonation of authority, and possibly conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. That's federal. I blinked, stirring sugar into my mug, still trying to wrap my head around the fact that this all started because I declined to pay HOA dues for a property that was never under their charter to begin with. The history was clear. My cabin sat on land deeded decades before the HOA was formed. Their boundary lines stopped well before the ridge. But ever since their housing development started inching closer to the lake, they had tried to push a narrative that the entire lake was under their management, that the HOA owned the shoreline, the access, even the wildlife, maintenance. It was a lie, but they repeated it so often that many began to believe it, except me. And now, after their attempt to enforce an imaginary jurisdiction with literal force, the wheels were in motion for their entire operation to come under fire. Alana didn't waste time. By that afternoon, she'd secured copies of the
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
By that afternoon, she'd secured copies of the HOA's charter, land annexation attempts, and minutes from board meetings that had been conveniently redacted before being shared publicly. She filed a complaint directly with the State Licensing Board for Real Estate Practices, citing multiple irregularities in how the HOA had advertised its boundaries and enforced non-binding rules on non-members. Simultaneously, she began the process of submitting formal affidavits to the Federal Civil Rights Division, outlining what she witnessed and naming names. "They didn't just make a mistake," she said, typing as she spoke. "They coordinated an action under false authority, broke private property, and attempted to detain a citizen. That's organized misconduct." Meanwhile, the local sheriff's office, long wary of stepping into HOA politics, was now being forced to acknowledge the severity of what happened. The deputy who arrived that evening to document the damage was already aware of who Alana was. He asked a few questions, carefully choosing his words. "Look," he said, finally lowering his notepad. "Off the record, everyone knows the HOA's been pushing its limits, but this is the first time anyone caught them with proof like this." And oh, the proof. Between the body cam footage Alana wore during every professional encounter, my cabin's multiple security cameras, and even phone video taken by a neighbor across the lake who heard the shouting and pulled out his phone, we had a complete, unbroken timeline of what had occurred. From the moment the HOA enforcers pulled up in their rented pickup truck painted white with magnetic decals reading "Community Compliance Team" to the second the door splintered and they stormed in like they were serving gar. A warrant. Every second had been captured. And worse for them, every single frame showed a complete lack of legitimate authority. But perhaps the most devastating blow came not from any video or badge but from what we found buried in the county records 2 days later: forged documents. It turned out the HOA had submitted a quietly edited map to the planning board 2 years ago, attempting to redraw jurisdiction lines to include a dozen lakefront properties, mine included, without Prumbrie, notifying any of the landowners. The map had never been formally approved, but it had been used to justify a long list of enforcement letters, threats, and now, breaking and entering. Alana's eyes widened when she saw it. "That's fraud," she said. "Flat out. This isn't just an overreach anymore. This is prosecutable." By the end of the week, letters went out. Not from the HOA, but from the State Attorney General's office, the local district attorney, and the Federal Housing Compliance Bureau. The HOA board was summoned for formal inquiry. The sheriff launched an internal review, and every homeowner who had ever received a suspicious fine or threat of lien began sharing their stories publicly. The next weekend, I walked out onto my now repaired porch and saw something I never expected. Neighbors I'd never even met, standing at the bottom of my steps, holding envelopes and documents, asking for help. Camry. They wanted to know what to do, how to protect themselves, what steps Alana had taken. "This isn't just your fight anymore," one man said, lifting his ball cap. "They've been getting away with this for years." And so began what I can only describe as the unraveling. Not just of the HOA's fabricated authority, but of the fear they had built their power on. As word spread, residents began to demand full financial disclosures from the board. They asked for audits. Some filed lawsuits. Others called for a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. Meanwhile, Carantha Board VP, who had personally kicked in my door, was named in a civil suit and placed under criminal investigation. Her smug arrogance disappeared.
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Placed under criminal investigation. Her smug arrogance disappeared overnight. No more morning runs with her clipboard. No more emails about Lawn Heights. She vanished from view, hiding behind lawyers and PR statements that didn't convince anyone. The best part? All of this was happening not because I shouted the loudest, but because the truth was louder. Because people like Alana knew how to wield it like a sword. The final straw came a month later, when the state issued a cease and desist order on all HOA enforcement actions pending investigation. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their contracts nullified. And for the first time in years, the lake was quiet not just in sound, but in tension. I stood out by the dock, watching the sunset shimmer over the still water, and realized something profound. They had broken my door, but they had opened a much bigger one. A door to accountability, to justice, and to the restoration of personal freedom on land that had always been mine.